Okay, welcome all to the very first Zoomed online YIVO Fellowship Lecture. This is the Max Weinreich Fellowship Lecture in East European Jewish Literature, and it is specific to, or is funded by the Vladimir and Pearl Heifetz Memorial Fellowship and the Vivian Lefsky Hort Memorial Fellowship. And I believe today in the audience we have members of the Lefsky Hort family. So welcome and thank you for helping to fund this, this fellowship. And if you like what you hear and you like what YIVO is doing online, please consider helping to fund what we do, because we can't we can't do our work without support from the public. So today's lecturer is Roni Masel. She's a doctoral candidate at New York University. Her dissertation is entitled National Heroism, Popular Pleasure, Violence, the Gothic and the Grotesque in Hebrew and Yiddish Literatures. And it considers fictionalized episodes of anti-Jewish violence in Hebrew and Yiddish literatures. She is, as I said, this year's recipient, or rather the 2019-2020 Vladimir and Pearl Heifetz Memorial Fellowship and the Vivian Lefsky Hort Memorial Fellowship at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. And next year, 2020-2021, she will be joining the Frankel Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan as an Institute Fellow. So congratulations, Roni, on that. All right. She will begin shortly, and as Alex mentioned at the outset, if you have questions, please write them in the question and answer box, and we will hopefully have time to get to them at the end. So thanks everyone who is attending, and thank you, Roni. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I can't really see who's here and who's not, but maybe we can chat later. I have a slideshow for you. Okay. So the title is Digging Up Dead Bones, Violence, Decadence, and the Grotesque in the works of Hayim Nahman Bialik and Leib Peretz. But I first want to begin by saying that while this talk is going to be about anti-Jewish violence in Hebrew and Yiddish literatures in the early 20th century, I'm giving this talk in solidarity with all who are fighting brutality and racism today. And I'm going to suggest a degree of playfulness in my reading of these literary texts. And I'm going to highlight from a distance of over a century since those events have happened, the multiplicity of ways by which Jews thought and wrote and read about violence. But I think that at the present moment of extreme brutality, the more accurate response is to fight them wholeheartedly and demand justice. But let's turn to our topic. So, how should we understand the representation of violence and brutality in Hebrew and Yiddish literatures? The conventional explanation in literary criticism and historiography assumes a national point of view. It claims that reading about anti-Jewish violence stirs in the reader an emotional reaction that leads him or her to let go of liberal assimilationist or revolutionary ideas, turn to read or write in Hebrew or Yiddish rather than other non-Jewish languages, and to embrace a nationalist worldview. I want us to pay attention to the fact that such claims constitute not only a historical account, which attributes the inception of both Hebrew and Yiddish literatures to a reaction to anti-Jewish violence, but that they also construct a theory of reading, a theory of a reader's response to literature. Underlying these accounts is the premise that the representation of violence in and of itself produces a collective sentiment. This textual function of violence, moreover, is presumably stable and predictable. The representation of brutality always produces a national collectivist emotion and interpretation. Already in 1907, Sholem Aleichem parodied this notion in his novel Der Mabul, The Flood. In this novel, a nationalistically inclined young protagonist called Sasha tries to win the heart of his friend, Tamara. Yet Tamara holds on to her revolutionary and assimilationist sensibilities. In his efforts to convince her, Sasha recites lines from Chaim Nahman Bialik's Hebrew poem, written in the aftermath of the 1903 Kishinev pogrom, which will be our main focus today. Sasha's extreme pathos in reciting these lines are not really enough to draw Tamara to him or to his Zionist cause. And even after they both experience anti-Jewish violence firsthand in the aftermath of the failed revolution of 1905, Tamara maintains her romantic interest in a non-Jewish man, alas, and Sasha's and Tamara's paths finally split. Yet despite Sholem Aleichem's parody, the common view today remains that textual violence inevitably produces a national sentiment. The wider project that this lecture is about, this lecture is part of, aims to refute this theory of reading. Instead of assuming a direct and linear relationship between literary materials and the reader's response to them, I ask, how should we understand the appearance of violence in literature? What are the multiple, unexpected, interpretive possibilities that we may find if we let go of the accepted national explanatory framework? So, in order to begin this exploration, I suggest that we turn to the most influential text on violence in Hebrew and Yiddish literatures in the 20th century, the poem that Sholem Aleichem referred to in his novel, Chaim Nahman Bialik's In the City of Killing, Be'ir HaRiga in Hebrew, or In Shchit Eshtot in Yiddish. We will first try to see what an ideological national interpretation of the poem might look like, while focusing on the description of brutality and on figures of the undead or of the living dead. But then, by digging up dead bones, or by doing somewhat of a detective work or an archaeological digging into the history of the poem and of its Yiddish translations, we will find some new, interesting, and concealed evidence which will force us, I argue, to reevaluate and consider other ways of reading this famous poem beyond the national framework. So here you see, this is the first publication of Chaim Nahman Bialik's poem, In the City of Killing, first published under the title Masa Nemirov, which means word or prophecy of Nemirov. So let us begin by looking at the poem. After the Kishinev pogrom of 1903, a group of intellectuals sent Bialik to Kishinev in order to collect testimonies and evidence on the pogrom and incorporate them into a comprehensive report. Bialik indeed documented eyewitness testimonies, yet instead of producing a report, he composed a long poem. The poem is a dramatic monologue by God, who speaks to his poet prophet and commands him to go to the city of killing. The divine voice imaginatively guides the prophet through the sites of destruction and animates for him the atrocities that had taken place there during the pogrom. At times, other creatures tell of the catastrophe, such as a spider hanging on a cobweb in an attic, relating a series of events. And I have here a quote for you, and I will apologize perhaps to Bialik's dismay for the explicit content and language. So the case of a disemboweled chest filled with feathers, the case of nostrils and 9-inch nails and skulls and hammers, the case of slaughtered human beings hung up from beams like fish, and the case of a baby found by the side of his stabbed mother, still dozing with her cold nipple and his sucking mouth, and the case of a child who was quartered and gave up the ghost with the word mama, and his eyes too are here calling me to account. Later, the poet goes down into a cellar and he speculatively witnesses a rape scene described by God. In that scene, while the beastly pogromists rape the modest and pure Jewish women, the Jewish fathers, husbands, and brothers cowardly stay crouching in their hiding places, watching their relatives being raped, and pray that no harm would befall them. But they're not the only ones watching. By using the subjunctive mood, the poem interpolates us, the readers, and positions us together with the Jewish men in the place of the voyeur, peeping through the cracks on the raped Jewish women in a structure that adheres to what Olga Litvak has called scopophilia, or, quote, the erotic satisfaction derived from looking for and at the signs of violence, end quote. This remarkable effect of the grotesque is further elaborated when the poem describes how the Jewish men, descendants of Maccabees and great-grandchildren of Lion, cowardly, quote, fled the flight of mice and hid like ticks and concealed away in the outhouse, the pig pen, and the other places smeared with shit, end quote. We find a climactic elaboration on the theme of bodily abjectness in the scene where the prophet is shown the pogrom survivors handling their open wounds and broken limbs in their act of schnorring, in begging other Jews for money and support. Finally, the godly speaker turns away from addressing the prophet and instead commands the pogrom survivors, the Jews of Kishinev, to go to the cemetery, dig up the bodies of their dead, and carry them around the world in a spectacle of grotesque martyrdom. And you have the quote here. To the graveyard beggars, dig for the bones of your fathers and of your sainted brothers, and fill with them your bundles, and hoist them on your shoulders, and take to the road, fated to merchandise them in all the trade fairs. And you will seek a stand at the crossroads, where all can see, and lay them out in sunshine on the backs of your filthy rags, and with a parched voice, sing a beggar's song over their bodies, and call for the mercy of nations, and pray for the kindness of Goyim. The scene ends with Bialik's harsh accusatory verdict for the Jews of Kishinev, which leaves no hope for rehabilitation. He says, quote, and where you've stretched your hand, you'll stretch it further, and where you've begged, you will not stop begging, end quote. Several scholars have noted that this verdict, and perhaps the poem in general, contradicts Bialik's commitment to the project of national revival. Indeed, if we look again at the graveyard scene, we find that in fact, it inverts one of the most central Jewish redemptive visions. It is a negative mirror of the prophecy of Ezekiel on the Valley of Dry Bones, in which the dead dry bones rise from their graves, are enveloped in new flesh and skin, and revive and return to the land of Israel. And I have here an image of an illustration of that prophecy in Ezekiel, which was printed in an anthology called Hilf, which was published in 1903 in order to raise funds for the Jews of Kishinev. So, but in Bialik's Kishinev version, the dry bones are being dug up not by God or his prophet, and not in order to live again and be delivered, but rather to serve as a prop of beggary for the humiliated Jews of Kishinev. Instead of a Tchias HaMeisim, instead of a redemptive resurrection, we find here what we might call, borrowing from our contemporary cultural imagination, a zombie attack of beggars. Dan Miron explained this duality between redemptive resurrection and demonic insurgency as Bialik's quote-unquote gloomy skepticism, as part of his overall ambivalence toward the project of national revival, aspiring for it on the one hand, while fearing its failure on the other. Somewhat similarly, Hamutal Bar Yosef described this dual expression of national renaissance together with decadent motifs as quote-unquote an embarrassing conflict between Bialik's outspoken ideological commitments and his aesthetic fascination in the decadence and the grotesque. However, a national reading of the poem would suggest that taking another look at those living dead figures would prove that this duality is in fact not a contradiction or a skeptic ambivalence, rather a productive generative tension, which is the very foundation of Bialik's national poetics. To start, we must first remember that this tension between life and death in the image of the living dead or the undead or the zombie is fundamentally political in the context of Jewish writing in the 19th and 20th century. Following widespread pseudoscientific writing on cultural, national, and physical decay and degeneracy, Jewish nationalists describe the Jews as suffering from moral, physical, and cultural degeneration and in urgent need of revival and regeneration. The best illustration of this image of living death, for our purposes, can be found in Leon Pinsker's influential essay from 1882, titled Autoemanzipation. And this is Pinsker with his very impressive beard. This essay calls on the Jews of Europe to let go of their hopes that the states in which they live will emancipate them as individuals, and instead actively seek out ways to solve their predicament as a collective. Pinsker began by describing the political problems that Jews face, or the main problem that they face. And you have the quote here in front of you. Among the living nations of the earth, the Jews alone exist as a nation since long dead. Along with their country, they lost their independence and underwent a decomposition which is incompatible with the essence of a uniform living organism. The Jews, in other words, are incompatible with the nations among which they live, not only because they don't have a territory of their own, but also because of their state of monstrous decay. And we'll see that even more emphasized in this quote. The world saw in this people the uncanny appearance of a dead man who walks with the living. This ghostly appearance of a walking dead man, of a people without unity and organization, without land or band, no more alive, but still walking among the living. This astonishing specter, unparalleled in history, without a model or copy, could not but produce a peculiar and strange impression on the imagination of the nations. But since the fear of ghosts is congenital and even finds some justification in the psychical life of humanity, why should its prevalence be surprising with regards to this dead but still living nation? And I continue. The fear of the Jewish ghost was inherited and strengthened through generations and countries. This fear led to a prejudice which, in conjunction with other causes we are about to discuss, has resulted in eudophobia. Eudophobia is a psychosis and consequently hereditary. And since it has been inherited through 2,000 years, it is incurable. Let's take a quick look at what Pinsker does in this quote. He begins by describing the Jews as ghosts. He says ghosts or Gespenst, but we might also think of them in other terms, maybe as other cultural tropes that integrate living with the dead, such as the Dybbuk or the Golem. But in any event, after identifying the Jews' pathologies and monstrosities, he explains to us that it is only natural that the other nations should fear such a ghostly creature. But then there's a magnificent flip. The fear of the Jewish ghost becomes itself a disease, a sickness, a chronic pathology. Eudophobia is a psychosis, he says, and consequently hereditary. And since it has been inherited through 2,000 years, it is incurable. What I want to claim is that this flip produces and performs the very auto-emancipation that the essay calls for. Pinsker turns the pseudoscientific discourse on its head. From a point of powerlessness, he achieves power. From being the object of that discourse, he becomes its producer, its ruler. This is another way of saying that by assuming the pathologizing discourse, or by describing the Jews as monstrous and the Gentiles as sick, Pinsker finds a way to solve the problem of Jewish powerlessness, to create self-rule and self-determination. Going back to Bialik, we can see that his inverted vision of a living death instead of a national revival does not stand in contradiction to his national agenda. Rather, the opposite. His expansive description of the humiliation, abjectness, and degeneration of the Jews of Kishinev is part and parcel of his political device, like the ghost and the monstrous are in Pinsker's text. The forcefulness of the image of the living dead is anchored in the fact that despite its contradiction, it is one, at once both living and dead. It imagines and encodes power and powerlessness, revival and decay, as the only ultimate binary choice for the national collective. In more familiar terms, and following what many scholars have argued in recent years, we can say that the poem produces the nationalist, particularly Zionist, negation of Jewish diaspora, a negation whose role is to portray the national territorial project in positive terms. The idea of revival and the images of decadence in the poem are therefore, we conclude, not contradictory. Rather, they generate the productive tension of life and death that animates the national discourse on revival, that gives it meaning and power. But at this point, I'm going to ask you to put aside everything I just said about the poem and the national discourse it produces. I began this lecture by saying that I look for a multiplicity of potentials in reading texts on violence. And so in the time that we have left, I want us to explore two alternative avenues to approach this poem as a historical material artifact. So first, against the theory of reading, which I presented at the beginning of this paper, according to which reading about violence always produces a national sentiment, I want to consider other sorts of affective, emotional reactions or sentimental reactions to this poem. In 1906, the writer and Zionist activist Vladimir translated the poem into Russian, and I brought the title page of that translation just because I thought it was very pretty. That was published in 1906. After its publication, the writer, translator, and literary critic David Frischman criticized the translation, or more accurately, not only the translation itself, but rather the very choice to translate the poem into Russian in the first place. He explains his position thus, and you have the quote here in the slide. So he says, "Why even render it in Russian translation? We are taking the greatest lament that has ever been written for us and deliver it to those people who are its very heroes and the ones responsible for its creation, and we expect them to feel what it means? Rubbish. These people do not need a second-hand poetic description of the pogrom, its brutalities and atrocities, for they know it firsthand. After all, they themselves are the principal authors of the pogrom." When he says that, them, he means the Russians, or the Russian reading, Russian speaking. So they themselves are the principal authors of the pogrom in reality rather than in textual vision. They have written this poetry, not with pen and ink, like poor old Bialik, but with axe and blood. Should we then deliver this poem to them so they could take pleasure in its beauty? I can imagine how appropriate it would have been if one translated Jeremiah's Book of Lamentation into Latin and gave it to Titus and his friends so they would take pleasure in its splendor. In this quote, Frischman positions blood and ink, pen and axe, pleasure and atrocity, and writing and violence all on one plane. There are several questions we might want to consider. For example, is Frischman arguing that writing about an act and committing an act are the same? Or Why does he bring the pleasure of reading into this discussion? What exactly is the relationship which he imagines between acting violently, representing violence, and drawing pleasure from both? Finally, if writing and beating are the same, and if ink and blood are the same, could Frischmann be arguing that by writing in the city of killing, Bialik enacted a pogrom on the Jews of Kishinev to the enjoyment and pleasure of his readers? The answer, of course, is no. But the entanglement that Frischmann ties here must lead us to a crucial conclusion. Textual violence and its affinity to pleasure, by its very definition as a product of aesthetics, as poetry, inhibits any construction of a coherent meaning and interpretation, or of a didactic or ideological message. By invoking conflicting reaction of pleasure and horror, the graphic representation of violence disrupts the literary text. It turns it into a site of textual destruction. We could therefore say that in material life, as well as in the symbolic order or in literature, violence wreaks havoc. By opening up the possibility and consideration of pleasure, which exists alongside horror and disgust, I want to turn to the second alternative avenue to approach this poem and to understand the influence it had on its audience at the time of its publication and later on. This alternative avenue is in the Yiddish translations of the poem. So the story of how the poem came to be translated into Yiddish is worth recounting for our purposes. Immediately after the poem's publication, the Hebrew and Yiddish writer Leib Peretz expressed his admiration for Bialik and his poem, and began working on a Yiddish translation of it without asking for Bialik's permission. When Peretz sent his Yiddish version of the poem to Bialik, Bialik became enraged at the partiality of the translation and at a few literal mistakes. After a heated correspondence, Peretz ended up publishing the translation in the Yiddish newspaper Der Weg, despite Bialik's fury. And this is the first Yiddish translation and its first publication in 1906 by Peretz. Bialik, in the meantime, began working on his own Yiddish translation, which appeared just a few months later. When he sent it to his friend, the Russian Jewish writer Ben Ami, he apologized for producing a book in Yiddish, which he called pejoratively jargon, and explained that, quote, Peretz's awful translation forced me to do so, end quote. Yet despite Bialik's professed dissatisfaction with Peretz's quote unquote awful translation, Bialik's own translation borrows a significant share of its language and imagery from Peretz. And we have here Bialik's Yiddish translation of the poem in a book titled Funza und Zorn in 1906, just a few months after Peretz's translation. So Bialik appears to have borrowed a significant share of its language and imagery from Peretz's. But most significantly, Bialik appears to have borrowed one full stanza that did not exist in the initial Hebrew version of the poem. The missing stanza, or rather the added stanza, is the graveyard scene, which I mentioned before, where the divine speaker commands the Jews of Kishinev to go to the cemetery, dig up the dead bones of their martyred ancestors, and schnorr with them, singing and groaning and begging the Gentiles for mercy with a hoarse throat. The genealogy of this stanza is contested. And this contested genealogy is important for us today because this stanza develops the image and the tension of the living dead in the poem. Some critics speculated that it had appeared in Bialik's original unpublished Hebrew version, which he circulated privately among friends. In my dissertation, however, I show how all evidence we currently have overwhelmingly supports another option, that in fact, Peretz developed this scene, and that without ever acknowledging it, Bialik adopted this the scene from Peretz and inserted it into his own Yiddish version of 1906, ultimately integrating it into the canonized Hebrew version only in 1923. So here you have the 1923 edition, which was published as a festive Jubilee edition in honor of Bialik's 50th birthday. This is the first edition where we have the cemetery scene in Hebrew. And just to recap, so we have 4 basic versions. In 1903, we have the first Hebrew version, which does not have a cemetery scene. In 1906, we have the first Yiddish translation by Peretz, which is also the first time that we see the cemetery scene in the poem. Then again, in 1906, we have a second Yiddish translation, this time by Bialik, which includes a version of the cemetery scene. And finally, only in 1923, do we see the final canonized Hebrew version, which includes a translation of Bialik's Yiddish variation on the cemetery scene. So basically, Bialik's version of the graveyard scene. So for our purposes today, there are 3 most important pieces of textual evidence to support the theory that Bialik borrowed this stanza from Peretz. One is that despite the fact that Peretz omitted large parts of the poem in his translation, this stanza is much longer in Peretz's version than it is in Bialik's. While Bialik's scenes comprises a total of 10 lines in Yiddish and 9 lines in Hebrew, Peretz's scene takes up 45 lines of the poem. And you can see here the difference visually. So this is Peretz's version, 45 lines, Bialik's Yiddish version, and Bialik's Hebrew version. Secondly, while Peretz's partial translation resulted in an overall fragmentary text, this stanza is the most cohesive, coherent, and fully developed unit in his version. Throughout his translation, he emphasized the poem's affinity to the grotesque and the Gothic, and in this lengthy stanza, it is even more pronounced. Where Bialik mentions only bones, dry bones, Peretz repeatedly invokes rotten flesh, together with the bones and the dismembered body parts. Also, among the injured, limping, broken-limbed Jews in Peretz's version, we see also small children who handle the dead flesh for a penny. And these children emphasize the stark duality of life and death that characterizes the grotesque. And finally, as Yitzhak Bakona has noted, in this stanza, we hear Peretz's own authentic voice and language, more so than any other part of the poem. By this claim, I mean to say that indeed death and the grotesque are a staple of Peretz's literary world. Specifically, there are striking affinities between this cemetery scene and Peretz's poetic drama by Nacht auf dem alten Markt, A Night in the Old Marketplace. And you see here the first version of that drama. So the first version appeared in 1907, a year after Peretz's translation. But Peretz was working on this drama as early as 1904, and evidently he shared early drafts of it with Bialik when both were living in Warsaw. These early drafts made a great impression on Bialik, who wrote enthusiastically in a letter to Sholem Aleichem that, quote, Peretz wrote a drama with which he will shock the entire world. So here we have photo of a staging of that drama, A Night in the Old Marketplace. In the drama, the night falls on a stereotypical marketplace of a Polish Jewish town. As the last living characters slowly disperse and go home in the first act, souls from the purgatory, from Oile Matoye, appear in the second act, and after them, in a third act described as a ballet of the dead rise from their graves and take over the abandoned marketplace in a demonic dance. In the fourth and final act, the dead grow weaker towards the break of dawn. When they return to their graves, the living appear again in the marketplace. Already now, before reading more of the drama, we begin to see Peretz's use of the figure of the living dead and the tension that he envisions between revival and decadence, a tension fundamentally different from that of Bialik's. At the end of the play, after a night of horrors, life returns to normal in rejection of apocalyptic fantasies of resurrection. So the drama as a whole has no real plot, and so its main driving force is the constant stream of figures that appear on stage. Most of them appear for a short while, and many never speak more than once. Among both the living and the souls from the purgatory, we find Zionists, Samists, and revolutionaries who argue over the best form of Jewish revival or solution for the Jewish condition in Europe. Yet, parodying the very idea of revival, national or otherwise, the dead rise from their graves in the old cemetery, yet they remain dead. They appear as both physically revolting and as self-interested and petty. And they often complain about what we might call their living condition in their graves, where they're constantly being eaten up by maggots and worms or suffering from frostbites. Among the dead figures, we see grayish-looking dead who cannot remember their names, old dead who argue during their daily prayer, dead children running around and playing hopscotch, a young woman and her mother who complain about the style of their shrouds, their tachrichim, and a klezmer group playing without instruments. They are thus neither living nor entirely dead, at the same time as they are comically, painfully human, and are therefore entirely unsuited for an apocalyptic prophetic vision. When the night nears its end, the young Apikoires, the heretic, tries to convince the dead to rebel against the day and against its herald, the tin rooster, standing on top of the old synagogue. He calls on them to refuse to return to their graves and instead dust themselves off, tear off of their corpses the cobwebs of Torah and tradition, and instead dance the can-can. Yet, when the rooster crows, the dead can no longer stand. Their limbs begin to fall off, and they are dragged back into their graves. Life returns to the marketplace, where when the night watchman awakens from his negligent sleep, the synagogue's shamus knocks on the townspeople's windows to wake them up for prayer, and two merchants continue their conversation from the previous evening and discuss business. By staging a scene of resurrection, Peretz's narrative fully materializes the idea of national renaissance and drives it to its final conclusions. What are we essentially being asked in this drama is whether the people is actually dead and in need of revival, or how to describe the Jewish condition at that present moment. As far as Peretz was concerned, that present was very much alive and not at all dead or in need of resurrection. That present, furthermore, is in the realm of daylight, when the dead retreat to the graveyard and the living return to the marketplace, and where the townspeople are concerned with their troubles and joys of everyday life. In order to further probe Peretz's use of the notion of revival and decadence, or of the undead, we should look at the following quote, which you have in front of you. Towards the end of the play, a figure called the Wanderer tells of a prophetic vision he's seeing. On the brim of the east, a hidden hand appears, spinning a red fog, binding air threads. A new day is being weaved. And on the brim of the heart, a hidden hand appears, spinning little gray fogs, binding little bleak clouds. Longing is being weaved. The duality of this vision, we should note, is not dichotomous and does not position the idea of revival through the metaphor of sunrise as the binary opposite of death, night, or decadence. For example, instead of the binary of east versus west, we see the non-binary construction of east versus heart. Or instead of day versus night, we find here day versus longing. In fact, this brings me to conclude that Peretz's play is not a symbolist play, for it avoids the binary constructions that are so fundamental to the production of redemptive symbolism, which as an aesthetic mode, it always aims for purification for a literary metaphysics. In Peretz's avoidance of the emulsifying power of symbolist modernism, this play uses decadence in order to collapse the productive dichotomous tension which activates the discourse on national renaissance between revival and decay. So here you have a photo of Peretz with perhaps his affinity to decadence. So what use then does Peretz make of the decadent mode and of literary grotesque? And how does this use differ from that of Bialik's? I propose that Peretz uses the decadence and the grotesque in order to laugh off the ideological distinctions of national revival or decay, while leaving room for indecisiveness. Instead of turning the image of the Jewish ghost or the living dead on its head, while still maintaining its power as an ideological device for national poetics, as Pinsker and Bialik did, Peretz embraces the political peculiarity of the Jewish condition in Europe embodied by the living dead. In short, in Bialik's model, the binary tension between revival and decadence activates the nationalist discursive apparatus. In Peretz's model, on the other hand, decadence and its aesthetic relatives serve to collapse that very opposition. I now wish to return to our poem in order to conclude this lecture, but I feel less comfortable calling it Bialik's poem because, considering its various manifestations, we now have to think of it as a text that is not one, as a heterogeneous text. We have the first Hebrew version, which lacks the graveyard scene. Then we have Peretz's Yiddish version, which elaborates significantly on the decadent and grotesque motifs, and specifically on the image of the living dead or the undead, by adding the graveyard scene. We then have Bialik's Yiddish version, which follow Peretz's model. And finally, we have Bialik's canonized Hebrew version, which also includes Bialik's Hebrew translation of the cemetery scene and covers over the contested genealogy and bibliographic trail of the poem. We should also mention Jabotinsky's Russian translation, which is an interesting case in its own right. And finally, we also have Peretz's drama, which includes many references to the poem and is essentially based on the cemetery scene. All these variations were simultaneously available to overlapping readerships in Eastern Europe in the early 20th century. A large share of readers could read the poem in at least two of the languages in which it circulated. And I remind you that Yiddish had two versions, so they could read it either in Hebrew and Yiddish or Russian and Yiddish or all three languages. And therefore, again, the poem appears before us in multiple material manifestations. Furthermore, not only do the texts we read construct a confusing bibliographic trail and expose a multiplicity of variations, but the representation of violence and brutality too summons multiple interpretations, multiple reading avenues, not only the reawakening of national sentiment, as I discussed in the beginning, but also other effective reactions, such as pleasure, anxiety, disgust, or desire. The representation of violence as a choice of literary material is therefore also unexpected, indecisive. Going back to questions I touched on in the beginning of this lecture, the task of telling an organized, unified history of Hebrew and Yiddish literatures seems difficult. Rupture, violence, and upheavals inform every moment and aspect of the production of both these literatures. Yet, rather than shying away from such rupture and indecisiveness, I suggest that we linger precisely on such moments of material, textual, and physical destruction from which we may hope to find new ways to narrate a sprawling story of the joint genealogy of Hebrew and Yiddish literatures in the 19th and 20th centuries. Thank you. Eddie, can you unmute yourself? Yeah. Okay.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was terrific. Really fascinating. It's really a lot of food for thought there. In part because you have Bialik versus Peretz, one who's very ideologically driven, or at least politically driven, versus someone who is, nationalistic to a certain degree, but also not, politically or ideologically driven. So that's very fascinating. And then you have the whole issue of all these different translations, which is fascinating. I'm curious, does Jabotinsky include the graveyard scene?
No.
He doesn't. Okay, so that's also very interesting.
Yeah.
And then you have, you also have this quote from Frischman, where he's upset that he's let a Yovan in Sukkah. He's he's allowed someone like the perpetrator into the private home. So that it's really compelling, really fascinating. Thank you for this. I don't know are there any questions from the outside? I see one. We have one, but it's just a link, so that's not it. So perhaps people will chime in. Let me just ask you if this is obviously one of your dissertation chapters. I'm wondering if you could, just for the benefit of the viewers, contextualize it within the sort of grander picture of your dissertation and how it's situated and what else we can expect to see when you're finished.
So I actually am finished. I'm defending my dissertation next week. So
congratulations.
That goes well.
I'm sure it will.
So thank you for that question. So all the chapters in my dissertation focus on either Peretz or Bialik, but I like to think of it as not a biographical kind of study, because the question that I ask is really more conceptual, and it's all about what is the use of, in both Hebrew and Yiddish literatures, in these themes and motifs and topics of the violence and the grotesque and the decadent and the Gothic too. So I begin in the 19th century in 1878 with a Hebrew poem by Peretz, and I continue onward focusing on texts that represent violence. And one of the main things that I try to do is to show how, while both worked with both Hebrew and Yiddish, they each kind of like projected themselves on one path or the other, whether Yiddish or Hebrew, but still any history of that context, any history of their work and of the larger context in which they worked, they were both very central in the literary arenas that they worked in, how any history that doesn't take into account both Hebrew and Yiddish is, let's say, bound to remain partial because of that strong affinity. Yeah. Eddie, you get a hello.
Oh, okay. Oh, so this is from the chat, not the actual questions. Okay, so so we don't. It seems we don't have any questions. So I'll just say thank you. This is really compelling. Good luck next week in your dissertation defense.
Thank
I'm
you.
sure you'll be fabulous. And I think oh, wait a second. We're suddenly getting questions. Haha. All right. So Robert Hort, who is one of from the family who helped fund this lecture, he asks, are there incidents of the grotesque and decadence in Hebrew? Well, I assume Hebrew literature he's talking about. So,
Can you repeat that?
so are there incidents of the grotesque and of decadence in Hebrew literature? And maybe how
Yeah.
widespread are those?
Yeah, there is, and it's a question more generally about how to explain those. Yes, of course, there's a lot of these materials in the works in the early 20th century, in Berdichevsky's work. Eli Kelchanan has worked on Steinberg, and there are many other instances, and it's a central question of how to explain these materials there, right? Because they talk about decay or the grotesque on the one hand, and then on the other hand, they hold on to some sort of an ideological commitment. So what I try to do is to show how in many cases they work together, such as in Bialik's model, where one informs the other, and how in other cases, such as Peretz's, and these are the cases that I find more interesting, it's in one way or another a renunciation of a nationalist or ideologized, kind of like mobilizing agenda.
Okay.
Of course,
All right.
yeah.
All right. Okay, next question from Hadas Binyamini. Can you tell me more about the visual culture of this? Were there visual depictions of decay that you came across? Were there specific acts of violence, types of descriptions of decay that you came across?
Oh yeah, I wish I had more. Then I would have more stuff to put on the PowerPoint. Of course, there is. This is definitely outside of my field. I don't really work with visual culture. There are strong influences of decadence art on the early nationalist Jewish art. I think a common example for that is the work of Lillian, the painter. But I guess I wouldn't be able to say much more on that.
Right. It's a separate category that
should explore in another.
That'll be your next book.
Right. Hope.
Okay, next question from Itamar. Wonderful presentation. I was wondering whether Bialik and Peretz discussed the political aspects of the poem beyond Bialik's critique of the translation.
I wish. No, the only directly ideological or like politically engaged topic that they touch on is their language choices. So Peretz accuses Bialik in writing only in Hebrew. He says to him, you're basically davening in the old shtibel of only Hebrew readers, right? You confine yourself to the realm of only Hebrew speakers or Hebrew readers, which is a small group of intellectuals, of the elitists, and you should talk to the people, to the wider people more generally, and use Yiddish. So this kind of like Peretz's populist sensibilities also inform, which he expressed in that letter to Bialik, also informed some of my reading of the drama and his interest in the people, right, in the folk, and in the everyday life of Jewish diaspora.
Right, and from the other side of that, we have a question from Matthew Johnson. He says, thank you for the brilliant lecture. I learned so much from it. Can you say more about why you think that Bialik reacted so negatively to Peretz's translation? Was it just because that he made errors and left things out, or was there something else?
Well, he actually did make some errors, and he had a weird way of explaining that. He was, I think, a funny figure. He says that he gave the translation to a young writer. He said he gave the original Hebrew to a young writer who would produce like a literal translation, and then he would embellish it. And that this young writer is the one responsible for the mistake. It seems very odd. I think that Bialik was not the only one mad about Peretz's translation. There's a letter from Sholem Aleichem to Bialik, who also says, this translation is awful. How did they publish it? So some of it is maybe, related to the fact that the translation was partial. It was very free. There are like several stanzas which he didn't even bother translating. And there are a few mistakes. But I also think that through Peretz's translation, Bialik then already saw new things in his own poem, which he didn't see before. So for example, it's like heavy fascination with the grotesque. So this is exactly what interests me. One could use the grotesque or decadent motifs in several ways, and the way in which Peretz brought these up in the poem touched on a sensitive point, I think.
Right. So I actually see in this is, I guess, one of the flaws of this system, but Robert Hort, who asked that initial question of is there more, decadent and grotesque works in Hebrew and Yiddish literature, he later added that are not, does that exist that isn't in reaction to anti-Semitism? That it's just sort of a sort of naturally occurring, Hebrew or Yiddish grotesque or decadence.
Yeah, so there is, I would refer you to read Elik Elhanan's work on Yaakov Steinberg, which, his early work is very much just kind of like along the lines of European late 19th century, fin de siècle, kind of like fascination with decadence and the grotesque.
Right. Okay, great, thanks. There's a question from David Abramson. He just wants to confirm that Peretz made up the cemetery scene. So it appears so, but you should answer.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I believe. Yeah, I believe that was the case. There are other who argue differently, but I think that all of the evidence that they rely on is unreliable. Let's put it that way.
All right, good. All right, Adriana Jacobs asks, curious if you see contagion at work here as well. I'm thinking of the Jewish prohibitions against touching the dead and the implications of incorporating the graveyard scene into the Hebrew, quote unquote, final version.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. I haven't thought about it from this kind of like, it is very pertinent thinking about contagion in literature and what a contagious text is. I'll have to think about it. It does exist then in the end in the Hebrew version, but it's kind of like a little bit of a sterilized version, as Adriana mentioned.
Okay, L. Posner asks, can you put these Jewish texts in context of other Gothic authors, such as Hawthorne or Poe?
Yes, I would. What I think I try to do in more generally is that I look at the particular way that these themes are manifested in Hebrew and Yiddish literature, because well, there's an argument to be made about the importance of paying attention to the continuity in circulation and in transfer of literary themes and motifs. I think that what happens often is that we neglect to pay attention to that which is different, to the fact that there are things that are lost in translation, like in our case, or are then regained or like crossed into the translation under the radar, like Peretz's stanza. So I use the translation here as a metaphor to say that it's the same in cultural transfer more generally, that we neglect to pay attention to the particularities. And what I try to do with the Gothic and the Decadence, specifically in Hebrew literature, is to account for how they work within that literary world and political discourse.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you for that.
All right,
question.
so we have another question from Joshua Blachorsky, who's a colleague of yours and a former student of mine. So his question is the Ezekiel 37 image common among Zionist thinkers during this time period, and how radical would this inversion have been? And he thanks you for the great talk.
Oh, it's good that we have a late antiquitist with us here, because I, of course, I think of it in a very confined way. I haven't come across it in other contexts. And yes, I think that it is very radical. And I think that it was very, shaking, or, yeah, it is a very radical decision to invert this really ultimate kind of like imagery of what a resurrection and redemption would look like. Yeah. Thanks,
Okay.
Josh.
We just have a couple more questions from the chat. Yaakov Herskovitz asks, how does the translation/theft influence how you think of authorship? Great talk, he says.
Thanks, Yaakov. I think that it makes me think less of the author and more of the reader, is what I would say. So basically, what I was trying to draw the lecture towards at the end is to say that it's not, we shouldn't think of the original and the translation as two, I don't know, independent objects that we should think about. They're really all available at the same time to the same readerships, the same readers. And in a sense, what I'm then more interested in is how did that readership react to these texts, and what were their, I can't always tell exactly, like I don't have always actual evidence to say what a certain reader thought or didn't think. Although we have a few cases where it becomes interesting. But anyways, what I am interested is in what are the possibilities, what are the avenues, what are the different ways that one could approach a text, which then of course becomes more than one text through its translations and through its retranslations and edits and variations and differences in censorship, in different years. Yeah, so this becomes the center of what I'm interested in.
Okay, great. All right, one last question from Shalom Leaf. Says, thanks, great presentation. Actually, there are more questions popping up. It seems to me that Bialik uses the grotesque and the decadent to critique traditional Jewish life, for example, Levadi, as well as to push his Zionism. So I imagine he's asking what you think of that.
Yes, so I think thank you for that question. And I think I tried to hint at his negation of the diasporic way of life, the Jewish diaspora in general. And I think that, and it's true that it exists in many other poems like Levadi, but also other like Nefei Midbar and B'Tshuvati and others where he, and Achen Chatzir Am, where he critiques the Jewish passivity or the Jewish inability or lack of will to participate in a revival. And I think that, as I said in the lecture, that his national agenda, his Zionism, is closely tied to the way that he rejects the traditional, let's say, Jewish way of life.
Okay, we have one last question. I don't know if it's an answerable question, but we'll try. George Eliot's, it's from Iris Tillman Hill. George Eliot's Daniel Deronda, Daniel under the influence of Mordechai becomes a Jewish believer imbued with Zionism. I'm curious what kinds of sources may have influenced Eliot.
Oh, I'm not sure, but you should talk to my friend Daniel Drori, who works on Daniel Deronda and its translations into Hebrew in the Zionist context. But I'm not sure that I can answer that.
Okay, so since you can't answer that, of course, there's always one more question. This is absolutely the last question because we're out of time. This is from someone I believe who's a colleague of yours, Tova Benjamin. She says, thank you for the great talk. Where do you think the usual explanatory framework, violence and nationalism, came out of, and why did it persist?
So that's what I try to do in my work more generally. I think that the more important question is why it persisted. So from where it began, we see accounts of anti-Jewish violence as the origin for a national movement or for modern Hebrew and Yiddish literatures already in the late 19th century. So this is kind of like a very old story. What is more interesting is why does that remain the accepted view of these texts? I would suggest maybe that there's something to do with the course of the 20th century and violence and anti-Jewish violence being kind of like a touchy view in a touchy topic that makes people be wary of looking at the more playful sides of it, like David Frischman recognized already in the beginning of the 20th century.
Right. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. This was a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone who joined us. Again, if you liked what you saw, please consider making a donation to YIVO so we can continue to support these kinds of academic projects. There are a lot of them, and the current crop of people working in these topics is really fantastic. So thanks, Roni, and good luck in your defense. I'm sure you'll be amazing.
Thank you, and thank you for all who asked questions. They were really great, and I took some notes. Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.